Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Sunday afternoon. I'd like to start by asking you to look at this landscape in West Sumatra and Indonesia and think about what do you see. So I see, for example, rice fields in the front. I see some houses in the back, forests on the mountains. But there's an extra layer to this landscape that you don't see immediately in this picture. For example, that forest in the back, that's actually a community forest. And because it's on the slopes, it's considered protection forest under Indonesian law. The community in this landscape feels a very strong sense of togetherness. And they actually work together to protect this forest, not just because they have to, but because they know that it's important to have that forest, because it regulates the water supply to the rice fields. So these rules and decision-making processes, they shape the landscape, and therefore they determine the picture as we see it here. And those rules and decisions is what we call landscape governance. And because it sort of influences the sustainable or unsustainable use of the landscape, it's very important to understand how they are organized, these governance processes. So that is why we say, let's talk about governance. But that's not an easy conversation to have. I mean, governance is considered abstract and complex. But fortunately, we are here today to introduce a tool that can help with this conversation. My name is Maartje. I work at Tropenbos International. And we co-developed this tool called the Landscape Governance Assessment. And with me on stage today is Katherine. She's from NTFP exchange program in the Philippines. And she organized and facilitated 5 landscape governance assessments in the Philippines. So what can the landscape governance assessment do for you? First of all, it creates an overview of the key governance processes in the landscape. It also stimulates dialogue and learning between stakeholders in the landscape to understand their governance and its importance. And finally, it helps in the identification of key steps towards improving the governance of the landscape. So how does it work? It's actually just a 2-day participatory workshop with the people in the landscape. It's structured around a set of indicators. So for example, one of these indicators is transparency. Now, we realize that transparency is still sort of an empty term. It's very difficult to understand what that means on the ground. So what we've done in the assessment is that we come up with these guiding questions for the discussion. So for example, for transparency, these questions are, do people know how decisions are made? Do people know about upcoming decisions? To what extent are decisions and their consequences explained? And what are barriers to accessing information? So how does it work? It's a 2-day workshop with people in the landscape. They discuss these key questions to understand the governance of their landscape. They then together develop a vision of how they would like to improve the governance of their landscape and what it should look like in the future. Only then they assess the current status of governance as it compares to this vision for their landscape. And then finally, they identify key steps towards sort of achieving this vision.
So we did these governance assessments in the landscapes that are part of the Green Livelihood Alliance, a partnership of Tropenbos International, IUCN Netherlands, Friends of the Earth Netherlands, and the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we did the workshops in 15 landscapes across 9 countries. In the Philippines, we organized this in 6 landscapes. So initially, I'm also doubtful of the landscape governance assessment. I mean, how can you bring different stakeholders in one room and not argue about everything if you talk about landscape governance? But the tool provided neutral venue to reflect on how rules and decision-making processes are carried out in the landscape. It was also my first time that many stakeholders sat together and discussed their participation in the landscapes. In the first workshop, I facilitated the civil society group, and in that workshop, they discussed the sense of community among NGOs and how they collaborate or the lack of it when there are projects and issues. It also made me realize that everyone in the landscape can and should assert their participation. that beyond raising your issues during demonstrations, you also need to take part in the processes in the landscape governance. So in the discussions during these workshops, it helped the stakeholders to find ways on how to improve landscape governance. They also identify their roles. For example, in General Nakal, the first one, the indigenous group reflect on their own internal governance and decided to start making improvements in the transparency and accountability mechanisms for indigenous group. So in Northern Sierra Madre National Park, the second one, the indigenous people's representative in the Protected Area Management Board increased from 3 to 11. In Palawan, a municipal mayor started making improvements in the non-timber forest product permitting system, which will allow better benefits for the communities from the forest. The stakeholders also realized the need to institutionalize good practices already happening in their landscape, one of which is an initiative on social fencing by a protected area, which contributed to successful community-based sustainable tourism and good benefit-sharing mechanism for indigenous people. So in short, these assessments made the stakeholders in the Philippine landscapes understand the importance of good landscape governance and also stimulated for people to work together. So it can also happen to your landscape, and we are inviting you to use this tool also. There's a detailed manual available, and it's also online. So let's stimulate conversations in the landscapes across the globe, and we make sure that we talk and also act on good landscape governance.
Thank you.